there's a lot there, and it was all great. I have a few comments. So your discussion of Bohr's character very much, I mean, it brings me back to Lee Smolin, who I've talked to a couple of times recently, and I just read his book Einstein's Unfinished Revolution, which I think came out 3 or 4 years ago. But he also talks a lot about Bohr. It's much more of an invective about the anti-realists, but it's an amazing how an endeavor that should be, I mean, mathematics aside, the paragon of objective impersonal investigation can in effect be dictated and steered by a person with such strong anti-realist philosophical prejudices. I mean,
It's quite amazing. I mean, like I say, I think there are a lot of stories you can tell about this, about what was going on in people's heads. I don't think, for example, this was completely independent of things like, say, you know, all kinds of phenomena. The rise of literary modernism in the beginning of the 20th century, the influence, especially on people like Bohr, of philosophical figures like Hegel, and and his countryman Kierkegaard. Um, um, you know, there was, there seemed to be enormous intellectual revolutions going on all over the place. That was kind of the thing to do. Okay. In literature, there was supposed to be a crisis of representation. Okay. Which had to do with the origins of literary modernism. I don't have any historical evidence at all for this, but it makes so much sense to me to imagine Bohr saying to himself, you think you've got a crisis of representation? Okay. You got a crisis of representation about human motivations, about history, I got a crisis of representation about rocks. Okay. This
yeah,
is infinitely more radical than your crisis of representation. So I think there was a spirit of, that had to do with Hegel, that had to do with Kierkegaard, that had to do with the rise of literary modernism in the beginning of the 20th century and so-called crises of representation. There is no doubt that the development of quantum mechanics was an influence on lots of people who were importantly involved with the rise of literary modernism. I think you can tell a lot of stories about Virginia Woolf, for example. I think you can tell a lot of stories about Joyce. I think you can tell, there's a Walter Benjamin has two essays that I know of about Kafka. One of them, there's an earlier, longer one, which never moved me that much. There's a shorter, later essay about Kafka, which I find extraordinarily moving. And one of the ways he reads Kafka, he starts out by saying, I know there are all kinds of standard readings of Kafka about the bureaucratic structure of modern life, about this, that, so on and so forth. I want to read Kafka as a reaction to the discoveries of modern physics. Okay. Or at least that's one of the ways he wants to read them. And he starts out with this long quote, this famous quote from Eddington's wonderful book called The Nature of the Physical World. This book was apparently an enormous influence on Walter Benjamin. And he starts out with this famous quote from Eddington's book about how complicated it is, given the picture of the world that we have from modern physics, to walk across a room. Okay, that the electrons in the floor are smacking into the electrons in your feet, and you're trying to keep your balance. And it's a very, very beautiful passage. Benjamin quotes this passage at length and says, I can't think of any passage anywhere in all of literature that's more like Kafka than exactly this passage from Arthur Eddington. Good. So anyway, I think there was a zeitgeist that Bohr's attitude, and that Bohr's sort of undermining of the realistic, objective aspirations, traditional aspirations of physics, that he thought it fit in with. Okay, they saw themselves. These people saw themselves as at the vanguard of a tremendous intellectual upheaval that was much bigger than just physics. Okay, that was going to expand to lots of things. He had all of these Gurdjieff like slogans. A trivial truth is a truth whose negation is false. A profound truth is a truth whose negation is also true. Okay. Of course, you can smell Hegel in this a mile away. So, yeah, it is funny that was the case. It is funny that would succeed in physics. I mean, there was this funny combination of things. On the one hand, they had this absolutely useless and mind-numbing dogma about anti-realism, about what he called complementarity, which is this doctrine, this sort of Hegelian dialectical sort of doctrine that I've just been talking about. So there was all this fluff around the mathematics that they had. Then they had this mathematics. They had this recipe for predicting the outcomes of experiments, which was unbelievably, breathtakingly powerful and accurate. Okay. So they had this sort of glamorous talk. They had this insane predictive power. This is a compelling combination. Okay. And was a compelling combination to lots of people.